So maybe there's somebody in your office who's known for saying, it won't work. You know, we tried that. You know, they come in every day and they talk about the worst possible thing that happened to them, and just how dreary and bad, and how the world is against them. That's the wet blanket. You know, that's the complainer, or the whiner, the one who's eternally looking at the glass half empty. The world's against them. And so we want to talk about them and how to manage them in our group, organization, squad, station, whatever. But before we do, let's just remember the 3 underlying principles. Every time we're dealing with challenging relationships, we need to remember, number 1 is that it's not about changing people. You know, all these things we're doing here is not about to give you tools. Hey, here's how I can change people to be how I want them to be. No, 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 no. You don't want people to be the way you want them to be, because they'd all look like you, and it would be, you know, just kind of like a vanilla world. We don't want that. What we do want is the second underlying principle is to give you tools to help you manage, cope, or maybe even leverage the wet blanket in such a way that they can become an asset or less painful to deal with, okay? So maybe we're looking to change you a little bit. And then the third one, all you can do when we're talking about difficult relationships is simply your best. That's all that you can do. And the Apostle Paul kind of points to that in Romans chapter 12, verse 18, when he says, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So the goal, living at peace with everyone. 2 caveats. Number 1, there are things that you cannot control. If it is possible, Paul says, which assumes it might not be. So you can't control certain things, certain people, but there are things you can control. That's why Paul says, as much as depends on you. So we seek to control the things that we can control. And again, what are the things that we can control? That is our behavior, our attitudes, our response, particularly the wet blanket. So let's look at the wet blanket. What are the top 5 qualities of the wet blanket? Well, of course, number 1 is that they are negative. They're pessimistic, and they think the world's against them, and there's this negative energy about them that you really, and we'll talk about this, you need to guard against. Number 2, they are what we would call fatalistic. In other words, there's little control over their environment or over their world. You know, it's just kind of like, you know, God is doing these things and we can't stop it. The best we can do is learn to manage it. So it's kind of like shrug the shoulders, there's nothing that we can do about it mentality. Number 3 is that wet blankets tend to be a little anxious, and the reason why is because, I mean, they're always expecting failure or disappointment, you know, right around the corner. So, you know, it's tough to kind of remain secure and calm when you're just expecting, you know, an accident to happen inevitably. Number 4 is that wet blankets can be very contagious, because inside of all of us there's this little fear of you know, the worst thing happening, and so sometimes wet blankets trigger that within us, and so all of a sudden we find ourselves, you know, being a little wet blanket ourselves. And then number 5, wet blankets tend to be stagnant, reliably consistent. There's not hope for change, so why bother trying to change? So they don't get too excited kind of either way. They're just kind of there. Consistently consistent. Reliably kind of being the wet blanket. So those are the top 5 qualities. Now let's go under the hood a little bit and kind of explore just kind of, you know, under the mask or in the heart of the wet blanket. Number 1, sometimes wet blankets use pessimism as a defense mechanism. In other words, it's, you know, they kind of lower expectations means less disappointment. You know, if I'm expecting you to fail, I'm not going to be disappointed when you do, because I've already kind of prepared myself for it. So it's like they guard themselves against getting hurt by lowering expectations. And sometimes that works in their favor, because it does, as we talked about before. They're consistent, they're even keeled. Number 2 is that wet blankets can be slow to trust. If I thought that you were going to fail me or disappoint me, I'm going to be slow to trust you. I'm going to be slow in a relationship to kind of let you in, if you will. So they can be hard to be in relationship, especially intimate relationships with. But the third thing is that they tend to be very loyal as well, because once you have broken through, you know, that barrier, they are going to be there for you. They're going to be consistent. They're going to be loyal with you to the end. Number 4, they are generally very prepared. This is where they can be an asset, because if they're expecting disappointment, if they're expecting that a plan's going to fail, they're going to have plans B. They're going to have plan D, all the way to plan Z. Here's all these contingencies if and when something fails. So they might be good to have that way. They know Murphy very well. Number 5, this might sound weird, but I think it's true, is that wet blankets are happily sad. They're just content in their melancholy. They're just used to it, and so they kind of find this kind of just this pleasant negativism, if you will. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it kind of makes sense to me. And so those are the underneath the hood in regards, and you can see them up there of the wet blanket. Now, there might be a wet blanket in your station. Or maybe you work for a wet blanket, or you're in a relationship. Here's 5 things that you can do to help you manage, cope, or I even dare to say leverage. In other words, utilize or take advantage of having a wet blanket in your workplace. Number 1, as always, maintain your composure. Wet blankets are going to trigger emotions. Wet blankets might just cause you to kind of snap into some kind of reactionary mode, so you want to be aware of what you're feeling around the wet blanket. So if you're just at home and you're complaining about the wet blanket to somebody, stop and think, what am I feeling? Am I feeling the urge to respond to them, to change them? Am I just reacting, with just, I have to just inject positivism into this? What's going on? Identify the emotion, okay? So critically important for you to kind of respond in a way that is not just reactionary, but is proactive. In other words, leading towards an end that you desire. Number 2 is to guard against the infection of the wet blanket, because again, we all have a little fear inside of us of something going bad, and wet blankets can trigger that. So just be on guard, because there can end up a conference room full of wet blankets if we're not on guard against that. Number 3, and I like this one, it's just my personal personality type, if you will. Use humor to deflect or guard against the wet blanket. Proverbs chapter 17, verse 22 says, a cheerful heart is good medicine. And I think if we use humor appropriately, it kind of releases stress that the wet blanket might cause, in a room, in a conference, but it also, I think, diffuses the sting of their cynicism as well. So use appropriate humor. Number 3. Number 4 is don't lose your focus, because a wet blanket is going to challenge your focus. It's going to challenge your dream. It's going to challenge your mission. It's going to tell you why you can't, you shouldn't, or you won't. And so, that might be good because we want to be challenged, but yet at the same time, we need to be prepared for it. And, if this is your dream, then don't let them take you off course, because they will certainly try. And then number 5. Appreciate the gift of the wet blanket. If you have a wet blanket in your station or in your building, how can you leverage them? Well, they're going to be the ones to come up with a foolproof plan. They're going to be the ones that are going to investigate every nook and cranny of what you're talking about to see where the potential flaw, where Murphy might show up. And if you have a wet blanket in the S3 shop, they might not be the greatest person to party with, but you want them looking at what you're planning, because again, they're going to be the ones to make sure it is sound. Okay, so then in some ways they're like the critic, because you're just going to be this bloodhound for vulnerability. So we're talking about the wet blanket, and this is kind of how we can kind of leverage them towards our favor. Okay, again, it always goes back to Romans chapter 12, verse 18. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live at peace with everyone, and that includes the wet blanket in your workplace. So do this, and you will walk in peace, and you will have the best day possible.